So the risk question that we were
Okay.
taking a look at in DNI was in relation to speaker demographics and attendee demographics, and just trying to point event organizers, to some standard language around the ethics of how to handle that data. And so, surprisingly, it sounds like Sophia maybe didn't find something, and nobody on the call really had any idea where such a thing might exist either. So that was kind of interesting in that regard.
Well, IRB is actually, at least in the US, in many cases, it's legally required. It's not just a, hey, might be nice.
No, I know, but
You,
for event organizers, they're not held to the same standards as academics in institutions. So IRB is it's really a requirement only at the university level.
well, if it's personally identifying and if it's personal data, then you have the European GDPR, you have in the US a number of very specific privacy laws, although in the US it's a little more complicated.
I
Uh,
totally agree, but like IRB is a university institution, so
it's much more, yeah, research organizations at least. I don't know the scope of IRB actually. I think it's certainly not just universities.
All the,
I don't know how far it goes.
yeah, I mean, all the content is still hosted on University of Michigan, which I found interesting because like you're reading all these general processes, it's all coming out of one institution. But at least the language that I was reading is designed to be more general because it's trying to apply to any type of research. So like one that I really liked for this perspective, and I could put it in the notes, was the informed consent template. How do I paste this in?
Mm-hmm.
Uh-oh, sorry, I just did it
That's
like
okay.
text.
Totally cool. That's totally cool.
But I thought that was kind of a nice, like if we did want to suggest anything to say point to an established process and say, here's just basically what you should consider before you collect information. But again, it's like, it's not the same case at all. It's just, I liked it as a starting template, and the language is very broad because it is applying to both data collection and scientific experiments that might include biospecimens. So it's not just collection of your data, it could be collection of your cells, because this is all research. So it's kind of fun to see that language in there, but again, I think there's a lot to build on. So ideally it wouldn't be totally reinventing the wheel. I think the thing I wanted to bring up from the other meeting is I did notice in the DNI working group page on GitHub, it says explicitly that this task will not address data collection ethics. So we do state that. So we're not like, we've kind of like paved the way to not be held liable for any of this because we've actively claimed we're not addressing it yet. That doesn't mean we shouldn't, but I don't know if necessarily we're the right project. Like I was looking through the open demographics site that's linked to it. That's, I guess we're referring to, and they have a section on ethics that's currently blank. So it's clear that they think that that's something they might want to accomplish as a group.
Yep.
Mhm.
So I don't know, like I would be curious to maybe, I don't know if I know anyone on it, I can look into that and just see if that's something that they've started working on already. Because I think ideally it would be a collaborative effort across many different open source organizations because it's something that we all care about.
Yeah, it's and I wonder if there is. I feel like we talked about this in the main meeting. There must be some open source project that has considered what its data collection ethics are and posted it. David, I don't know if the Linux Foundation has thought about that at all.
What about data collection?
Data collection ethics, like what do we store, what don't we store?
Yes.
There's a legal compliance
Identity.
component and there's an ethical
Identity
component, right?
stuff, David.
I'm sorry?
Identity stuff, David.
Yay. Okay. So, all right. So first of all, there are some things, I mean, a lot of it gets pulled into the legal side here. And to be fair, I think legal is actually probably a little bit misleading because, you know, Mike Dolan and Steve Winslow are interested not just in, you know, how close can we get, but they're generally trying to keep things on the straight and narrow, far away from, wow, how close can we get before we break the law?
Right.
Yeah, so I think you're going to immediately see there is indeed a policy involving privacy. There's a related policy involving um, specifically, what is it, telemetry data, because
Okay.
that's where some of this really shows up in spades, is when software starts monitoring itself, and then self-reporting back. That's a particularly concerning case. And so we have, the Linux Foundation has, GDPR things and so on. So,
Yeah,
um,
but the OpenSSF has actually got, that project actually has a whole group working on identity. And it seems to me that that's potentially quite related here in terms of the constraints around
possibly.
identity. And, what are two people the same? Are they different? What are some of the, it's an augmentation in some ways.
What project is that? Is there a link for it?
I'll let David speak now.
Yeah, there is a link for it. OpenSSF developer identity. I will go hunt for you a link because I know how to type into Google.
Yeah, I can do that too. Open Source Security Foundation.
Yes, but what you really want is the working group for developer identity on GitHub, and I'm going to copy and paste that into these little notes right here. If I know where I'm putting.
There it is.
Alrighty, so all right, so I'm going to stick in as E. Open SSF developer ID working group. All right, you can, feel free to move that around to a better place.
No, that's good. That's good. That's a good place.
One thing I should note is that the OpenSSF, they have, in theory, established working groups, but they're still writing up what scope they actually have. So, like the developer ID is talking about, well, maybe we broaden our scope radically and change it, and so they're still figuring out kind of what they're doing, but it seems like it could be related.
And possibly it may make sense for some people who are interested in this area to sort of drop into those meetings and start to advocate.
Yeah.
Yeah. How often do they meet?
Yeah.
It sounds like it might be something that you are interested in, Sophia.
Yeah, I'll look into that. And I like the idea of building off of the Linux Foundation if it's something that they're already working on.
Stupid question. I realize this. I'm jumping in the middle of a meeting and screwing things up, and my apologies. But I honestly am not sure what what this working group is trying to do, and I wish to be helpful. But
yeah. So our goals are right now focused on. I'm not sure how to put this, but looking at sort of developer flow and approval, and using tags to try to start to assess the process in projects to understand the degree or extent of quality that is present or identifiable from the trace data that can be drawn from the artifacts that are left behind in the process.
okay,
So,
attempt to understand the quality of the project results.
Yeah.
Based on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was asking Kate and Sophia to help me out.
Okay, let me try to up level it and see if I can do it right.
Okay.
Basically, this group is trying to focus on identifying elements that could be used for doing risk assessment of project health, as well as, can you trust this project? Does it have certain things? Are there indicators that we can find from the data that are risk? And so a set of metrics have already been defined, one of which is actually, does it have a CI badge? Okay.
Huh?
And so,
Yay.
okay. Because a lot of the things that we were caring about initially have been covered by that in some ways, and by sub areas in there. And
that is one of our defined metrics, I think, already.
Yeah, it is a defined metric, and
it is.
So there's some other areas around there we're looking at, but what we're looking at is like, okay, if one of the things we were sort of tackling a bit earlier, how long does it take for pull requests to get satisfied? Is it community responsive? Things like that. That was one of the risk metrics that was emerged.
Yep.
And now we're sort of looking at, how well are they signaling communication between themselves, things like, and that's where the tagging is coming in.
And
How was that, Sean?
That was really good. That was
Okay.
really good. We also are concerned about we have a scope that is broader than that includes looking at testing and test coverage kinds of metrics, as well as have already released and have tools that give us some really good licensing metrics. So legal risk is covered. I think this flow is largely related to wanting to understand, I think, safety critical systems and how good their process is, because there's I suppose, I don't know how to say this, but from Kate and the discussions that we've had, I think it's the concern for safety critical systems is process as an indicator. It's not necessarily the only indicator, but it's a significant indicator. And I think Sophia's interest is less from a safety critical system perspective, but more from a broader open source health perspective. I don't think those are mutually exclusive things. I think there's if I understand, and I'm reflecting on my own experience with safety critical systems, there's a level of rigor expected there that is maybe not always found in open source projects. Is that fair, Kate?
Yeah. Sometimes open source is higher. It's just they don't have ways of expressing it yet.
And Sophia, did I maybe explain a little bit about your perspective on the developer flow and the tagging and
I mean, I think the up leveling point is it's all coming back to things that impact project health. And that if we look at it from a risk lens, how do we reduce that to ensure the project continues to run smoothly, continues to grow, continues to mature? And things that might interfere with that are things that would slow down the approval process, or the barrier to contribute because it just takes too long to get a code contribution reviewed and into the system. And so by better understanding, my focus, I'm trying to solve this both internally and externally, just to get a better visibility on approval chains within projects. So potentially identify if there are an excessive number of people involved, or if there are people that are on lists that aren't actually doing anything and should be removed, and they're just slowing the project down because they're getting CC'd and not participating. So if we find a way to automatically flag how many people are actively contributing during the chain, then maybe we can find a way to either reduce the process and or proactively prune it so that people aren't still sitting in approval chains when they're not actually moving things along. Because people move around, they contribute, then they move to other parts of the project, and that isn't an issue. It's just if the records aren't kept up to date, then that can create lag and frustration and friction in the contribution flow. And so we're thinking about it from the perspective of mostly the Kubernetes community, because that's the project I'm working with the most right now. But I think it's an issue that could expand to more projects, and just thinking about it from keeping contributors happy and reducing burnout by not making the contributor flow too cumbersome.
Okay, I just added a note to another OpenSSF working group, which I wouldn't be surprised if there's a need for some liaison of some kind, because they're also interested in measuring, although they're interested in measuring risk for security specifically.
At one point, Sophia, in the general meeting, you had mentioned maybe there might be a connection with the Kubernetes devstats.io project.
Yeah, so I followed that a little bit more. Turns out it's one guy and there's no meetings.
Oh my God. It's so there's a bus factor right there.
Yeah.
Devstats is one guy.
I think there's one guy that's maintaining it, and there is a slightly more structured process right now around getting feedback. So I saw essentially just a spreadsheet where people were like, this is where I'd like to see more and improved metrics, like creating more PR specific metrics around specific SIGs versus having it in general. Because looking at general PR close rates across Kubernetes is not helpful for anyone. But if you look at it for individual repositories, and individual repository owners can have more visibility on what's happening within their subgroup. So that was probably the most structured part of it. After that, the suggestion was like, oh, if you have ideas, just put them into the GitHub account. Into the GitHub repo, because he's got a GitHub repo, and that's probably the best way to just like openly suggest comments and feedback for anyone that might be interested. But sounds like it's very unstructured, and it's given that it's very limited support, then I don't know how quickly it's going to move forward, which is both good and bad, because that means more time to think about it, but also there's only one guy.
Devstats.io does not give one the impression that it's only one guy.
Well, I think there's a lot of cloning that happens.
Yeah.
So, like, if you look at it, all of the tables have the same structure, and they're all pulling on the same APIs, and even the company attribution is all coming out of the same JSON file.
Okay.
So it looks like it's just maintaining the one series of tables, and whether or not they want to keep that, and then once they have it, then they replicate it across all projects.
I see.
Which one are we talking about here again?
Devstats.io.
Devstats.io?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not doing a very good job of keeping the conversation focused, David, because we're introducing you.
That's all right. It's baptism by fire. I got it.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to serve as a little bit of a liaison for that effort, because I think CNCF projects have a lot of metrics that most other projects do not. So I think they're less out of the scope of CHAOSS in the sense of trying to bring metrics and visibility to projects who don't have those resources, where they do, even if the resource is just one guy. But I still wanted to pay attention to what they're working on to see what we can learn from them as a metrics and dashboard solution, as well as how they're being used. So I think that in itself has been interesting.
For sure. I mean, they have a lot of bots on Kubernetes, is what I've noticed.
Mm-hmm.
In theory, DevStats filters out bots. And I know we do for our own data sets as well. So they're usually pretty well identifiable. At least that's the assumption. I don't actually know what that script looks like.
Okay. So we have some to-dos on tagging, and I think handling, like, I don't know that there's a working group. I think when it comes to the PII question, I think it could be considered a matter of risk. It's a question of if this group wants to take that on, or if we want to try to leverage some of these other projects.
I mean, I'm happy to keep looking at what other projects have done. Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of prior art.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, and I think it's the IRB is interesting because it's really about is the thing I'm doing going to affect somebody in a negative way or a positive way. So really, it's about protecting a research subject. And I think this, by the same token, protecting someone's identifiable information it's a similar responsibility. And I think particularly social science IRBs, ones that aren't grounded in medical IRB, probably have some really reusable parts. It's my thought.
I tend to agree. I've also, through the help of some colleagues, have been trying to just get wind of other organizations that are thinking about this. So like I found the Responsible Data Group. They are seemingly a nonprofit that thinks about this information and the responsible usage of data, but nothing focused specifically on our question in terms of, say, like how open source communities and projects collect information about their user bases and portray that information out as some sort of summary, aggregate, or categorization. So I'm just trying to see what we can find in terms of other bodies of people that are thinking about this. So potentially starting too broad for anything actionable immediately, but
Yeah.
I'm going to keep asking around because I seemingly have more people that I thought of that are in my network that care about ethics. So that's been helpful.
Yeah. I have not heard of responsibledata.io.
Nor have I. Interesting.
The Palantir is a big defense contractor, so this caught my eye right away.
Well, they're not really known for being nice.
No, that's what I was saying. They are not. That is not the reputation.
No.
Um,
And in terms of overviews, I thought the European Union had a pretty good
GDPR.
It wasn't even like, it's not even GDPR specifically. They just had like a laundry list of terms and expectations around what would go into ethics and ethical considerations. It's like, basically, if you wanted a huge comprehensive dump over what all the terminology and things you should know in this topic are. Let me see if I can find that and add it to the note.
Did I find it? Is this it?
Yeah, Linux Foundation has a really nice GDPR summary, by the way. Let me go
Is
find
this it on the screen, Sophia?
That's part of it, not the actual doc that I found, but
Okay.
I think in general,
So
Europe does this better than the US.
Yeah, well, they do because they've made it part of their legal system.
Let's see. Here we go.
I guess I don't know where somebody.
Yeah, are folks here already familiar with the GDPR, by the way?
I think we all are.
Okay.
Should this related efforts is related to data collection ethics, so I should indent it, right?
Yes.
Well, it's not. I don't think those are related to data collection ethics at all.
Oh, okay.
The number 3 says data collection ethics, and none of those are really involved with data collection ethics.
These ones, yeah, okay.
Yeah, these are just general efforts to related to this group, I think.
So I think the European one is related to data collection ethics, and so is the responsible data group.
Okay,
right,
so
Sophia?
yes. Yep. So I would say
added,
move them up into 3.
Yeah.
I added a link under the.
I saw that. All right, I'm gonna reach in here and try to move it.
I don't even know why they wrote this. It just it seems like here's some information you should know about ethics.
Well, probably for people like us who stumble into it on a community call and realize it's something we actually have to deal with if we're going to collect data.
I agree. That's why I found it helpful.
So there are the I'll just is there anything more that we want to discuss right now, or do we want to discuss like is data collection ethics aren't really a metric. What do we it's a concern that came up in the community call. It's a risk that open source projects who collect data take on.
I think if you're,
I don't know what to do with
if you're going to, sorry,
please.
For those reports, if you're going to say that someone having this event is following ethical guidelines for data collection, you have to have some way of measuring it. So it has to be a metric.
Okay.
Or at least it influences the metrics you can give.
Yeah, I think the same way we've got a code of conduct in the community, should we be looking for some sort of statement from the projects about how they handle data.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's kind of a binary then. Like, do they have a statement? Do they not?
Yeah, it's starting to sound like that right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of the badging program, which is where this conversation originated, one of the concerns is people from underrepresented populations. If there's a small number of them filling out a survey at a medium-sized conference, they're basically identifiable if they share their background. And what other ways? I mean, I don't know how to handle that. And I think what Sophia's been searching for is precedent for how that gets handled.
Yeah, when we were having at Linux Plumbers, we had a BOF about the kernel stats and some of the diversity stats in there. And the question was asked about, well, you know, you're just a male, female. And well, the challenge is we don't have ways for people to self-identify in a way that they can trust responsibly. Mm-hmm. It tends to be on a one-on-one personal relationship perspective. And so, you know, I know there's a couple of other, well, you know, basically non-binary sitting in the community participating, but we didn't have a really good way of including them explicitly. And there's such a small number compared to the larger scale, 4,000. Having one or two doesn't really show up, you know, statistic, so to speak. So it was something that was talked about a fair amount. No good solution out there right now. Knowledge bases are from, you know, discussing with people, letting them know, and then them letting you know that they're comfortable asserting certain things.
I will note that under the GDPR, a lot of that kind of data is considered especially sensitive, mm-hmm. And you know, and you have to have, you know, there's a higher, it's called sensitive data, and it's subject to all sorts of higher thresholds. And unfortunately, that includes racial, ethnic origin, you know, political opinions, religious, that sort of thing.
The challenge is if you're trying to improve diversity, you need to know where you're starting from. And
right, like, but of course, you know, I got that. But if you're going to collect it, there are now additional. I mean, I don't think those two statements are in conflict, but it means that now you have additional concerns when you're collecting that data.
Yeah, I think that's getting into the ethics that we're talking about here. The question is, how do you, like, you know, how can you classify a project in terms of its responsibility of behavior? I guess to Sophia's point, I'm just wondering if she's found anything on this stuff where, you know, if a project's busy collecting data about people, how can they assert how it's being handled and what's being reported? You know, in the sense if you're keeping it for your own demographic, you know, purposes and for trying to improve certain characteristics or trying to do outreach, which are ethical in theory, practices, how do you make sure that it cannot be, you know, the information cannot be scraped and then used for something that's not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing we were battling with not battling, but just debating, not even debating, just trying to clarify within the original conversation was the nuance between a statement around ethics and a privacy and data handling policy. Because one is the sort of why this is important, and another is these are the actual guidelines that we're taking around the consumption, handling, and usage of the data. And I think ethically you need some sort of privacy statement. So they're related but not the same thing. And so within the scope of our working group and CHAOSS working groups do the metrics that we encourage focus on ethics or the creation of a privacy policy. So again, I don't know quite.
I think it's more privacy policies where any focus has been had up till now. I think there's elements of how the data is being used incorporated in that policy, some of the policies, but I don't know if it's consistent.
Yeah, well, I know for the most part, most projects have some statements sometimes, at least the ones that have APIs where you can export the data. Like at least working with Grimoire Labs and knowing the projects that we're going to be pulling from, most of them do have some sort of data handling privacy policy. At least the ones that they do, we have to put in our own privacy statement internally for documentation to recognize that we're complying with their handling policies.
Interesting. We talked on the main call, and we've got about 6 minutes here, about is the privacy policy the same thing as data ethics, data handling concern?
I think those are two different things, per the discussion we've had prior.
I do think they're highly related, though.
They seem more yeah, they seem more like the same thing today than they did on Tuesday.
So I think the two questions, so similar to how the code of conduct is kind of a binary metric that you can say, does this project have a code of conduct? Yes, no. You can say, does this project have a privacy policy? Yes, no. And that's something we can measure. But then when we look at the ethical use of the data, that's almost that's an assessment of how they're using their data that's a little bit different than just whether or not they have a privacy policy.
Well, and I think actually, at first I thought Sophia was being possibly too rigorous thinking about it as an IRB concern, but in fact, I think there is a desire for us to have some people in a project have access to the sensitive data so they can understand where the project is at, but not publish information that we derive from data that people will use to when they fill out surveys, if it identifies people. So there could be levels of treatment, I think, which does become pretty similar to IRB, where as a researcher I know the identities of the people whose identities I obscure when I write about them.
Right. I'm just going to also flag, there's just come out a blog from Mozilla on this type of topic. It's probably worth doing. I just pasted in the chat too. It's probably worth looking at that as well.
I'm wondering if it might be as easy as just saying something to the of treating GDPR as the metric and saying, is the project GDPR compliant? And then you have a checklist of all the things that make up GDPR.
It could be.
I think that's reasonable. I think that's also something that exists today that we could point to and not have to reinvent or configure for this purpose, because it was designed with software in mind in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, you're probably not going to be able to make the legal analysis, but at least does the project claim to comply? I would rephrase it that way.
Thanks for sharing this article, Kate. I got distracted by it because I think they're touching on elements of privacy and ethics right up front.
Right.
Where is that link?
In the chat.
Oh, okay. It's too many. See, I don't get to see the chat when I'm sharing as easily. I always struggle to figure out how to do that. I have to hit more. Chat. Okay. This is the one that you're talking about, Sophia?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, that's it.
This certainly looks on target. And Emma
Yep,
Irwin.
and we have, we know Emma too, so.
Yeah, Emma was a big early contributor to the diversity and inclusion working group.
Right, so we might want to reach out to her and see if we can pull her into some of these discussions too.
Yeah, I think so. I'm just making
Understood. I would do the
a
same.
note, so it draws attention to that because one thing we might want to do is invite Emma to talk. We seem to all have some interest in this, and about a minute left, so I could invite Emma to talk with us the next time that we get together about this. And if she's not available, then we can find, we meet every 2 weeks. I imagine we'll find some alignment. She's in the Pacific time zone, so this time isn't too terrible for her. I think. I don't actually know what anybody's life is like right now, but I will take the task of inviting her unless somebody else wants it. I'll always surrender work.
Hey, I'm focusing on trying to get the tags before we talk
All
again.
right. Shooting Emma an email is not a hard task.
Okay.
With that, I think thank you all for a really lively discussion of things I didn't expect. I want to mention I do owe from August sort of the provenance and the sourcing of the community reports and how that works and explaining that. And so I will bring that with me to the next risk meeting.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just real quick, Sean, before you go, you've got a link off to the CHAOSS Metrics V2 level of completeness. Is that the current spreadsheet in terms of the kind of the status of the various metrics?
Yes, I think it's a pretty good. I mean, it's a representation of working, how it's working. What am I trying to say? So by the oh wait a minute, I went to it and then I forgot that I'd stopped screen sharing. So when we're building metrics out, which ultimately we will begin to do again, but I'm sure there'll be some metrics that are drawn from the tagging and process practices that we're looking at, and I think there could be some metrics in risk under business risk, possibly, or transparency, possibly related to privacy. So if we decide to work on it, then we would put it into it. We would create the metric title and then an in progress tag. And then we have a new status called moved. So like we could start working on this PII privacy practice metric, and it could end up being more appropriate to a different group. I don't know which group that might be other than the common working group. So, but we would still keep it. It gives us a way to keep it in here for cross-referencing,
Right?
Because we've grown as a project to having the number of things that we're working on across working groups. We need a way to track that. For example, risk is interested in certain things that evolution or value have defined or common has defined, and we can just link to their metric so that we don't like have a meeting in 6 months and think of that metric again. Like it's already on our dashboard and we've thought of it, and it's in a different working group.
So one of the, actually, since we're looking at this list right now on the business risk one, I'd be interested in having a bit of a discussion about that and talking about build versus execution dependencies, because that'll be useful for me for some discussions that we're having on evolution of SBOMs.
Yeah, I should mention that one of the reasons I'm asking is that I'm working with this newly forming open source security foundation, and there's a subgroup in there that's interested. It's badly named. They call it security threats, but I think they're really interested in a security focused metrics dashboard. And I have alerted them to the existence of CHAOSS, which they were unaware of. And now I'm alerting you about their existence.
Yep.
All right.
And I'm hoping to at least be aware. I mean, at least be aware of each other.
Is it security
I know about
ethics?
the aggregate project. I don't know what's happening in it.
Did you say security ethics, David?
Threats.
security threats
Threat.
dashboard. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, if you want to, if you're looking for a more ambiguous, hard to figure out what in the world they mean working group, don't bother. They've won.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll put that. We're putting that on the agenda for next time. And
Yeah, I say that laughingly because basically they're still they created the working groups, but in fact they're still working out the scopes. I mean,
Right.
this is a very early. I mean, just got announced,
Yeah.
so they're still gathering people. They just made their mailing list. They're still working out some things.
Sure.
So I want to make sure that folks are aware of each other. I mean, it's okay that different groups do different things. That's fine, or maybe take different approaches on the same thing. I just want to make sure people are aware of each other.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, we can cover that next time. And thank you all for a really lively and wonderful discussion. And I will see you in a couple of weeks.